Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Anarchist audio library. Today we're going to be finishing an article that we started last time, titled How Much Growth is Required to Achieve Good Lives for All? Insights from Needs-Based Analysis, written by Jason Hickel and Hickel Sullivan, read by Naomi Kirst-Schultz. 3. How much growth is required to ensure good lives for all? The extreme poverty line, including the BNPL, should not be used as a benchmark for social progress. As we have established elsewhere, extreme poverty is a sign of severe social dislocation, and it should not exist anywhere. It is necessary to use a much higher threshold, consistent with access to the full range of modern goods and services necessary for decent living. As we described in the introduction, one approach has been to use a $30 a day PPP line comparable to that used in many rich countries. One can then determine how much additional output is needed for all countries to reach the average income levels of rich countries that have relatively low poverty at this threshold. This would require increasing global output by at least a factor of 4, but this approach suffers from several methodological problems. First, as with the World Bank's extreme poverty line, the $30 a day line is a metric of broad-based purchasing power. It has no empirical grounding in human needs or the costs of essential goods. Whether or not someone on $30 a day lives in poverty depends on the prices and accessibility of essential goods. People living in the United States on $30 a day, roughly $900 per month, may be unable to afford adequate healthcare, housing, and transportation, to say nothing of higher education, because these goods are privatized, affected by profiteering, or, in the case of public transit, may not be available at all. In such a context, $30 a day would not be enough to ensure decent living and cannot be used for this purpose. By contrast, people living in a country with higher levels of public provisioning, e.g. public housing, rent controls, public health care, transit, higher education, etc., may be able to access necessary goods with substantially less income. Applying a fixed $30 poverty line to all countries ignores this issue. Second, using high-income economies as a benchmark is problematic because they are highly inefficient when it comes to the relationship between aggregate production and social outcomes. They tend to be characterized by high levels of resource-intensive and socially unnecessary forms of production and consumption, such as SUVs, private jets, cruise ships, fast fashion, mansions, industrial meat, weapons, advertising, and artificially accelerated product turnover through practices like planned obsolescence. This is why, despite high levels of aggregate output and throughput in high-income countries, large portions of their working classes are nevertheless deprived of affordable housing, nutritious food, and other essential goods. Importantly, research in ecological economics indicates that high-income countries could achieve better social outcomes at lower levels of aggregate production by scaling down less necessary output and focusing production on what is required for human well-being. These possibilities are obscured by a preoccupation with PPP incomes and GDP. The standard approach is therefore inadequate to answer the question at hand. $30 a day is an empirically meaningless way of defining poverty. Relying on broad-based PPP income casts what Mikhail Moatsis calls a, quote, veil of dollars, unquote, over the economy and obscures the specific forms of production and consumption that are necessary for meeting human needs. It also assumes away the possibility that poverty can be reduced through public provisioning systems. And the core economies, including Denmark, cannot reasonably be used as a benchmark for development because they have high levels of excess production and consumption. They dramatically exceed sustainable boundaries, and, as we described in the introduction, they rely on imperialist appropriation. If we take this approach, then yes, a massive amount of growth would be needed to end poverty by definition. And even if this was ecologically and structurally possible, people may still be unable to meet decent living standards, as in the USA, which has a higher GDP per capita than Denmark and still suffers widespread social misery, even if we assume Denmark's levels of income inequality. We must take a more rational approach. As we established in the previous section, eliminating poverty and improving human welfare requires focusing on specific types of outputs and ensuring universal access to these things. PPP-based metrics of aggregate output, such as GDP, measure the production of all goods, including those that have limited relevance to poverty and human welfare. This ignores important questions about which sectors need to grow and whether this could be achieved by reallocating productive capacities from other sectors. Labor and materials that are currently used to produce mansions and casinos can instead be shifted to producing affordable housing. Farmland used to produce beef for consumers in the global north can instead be used to produce nutritious foods for workers in the global south, and so on. Recent empirical studies have established the minimum set of specific goods and services that are necessary for people to achieve decent living standards, DLS, including nutritious food, modern housing, healthcare, education, electricity, clean cooking stoves, sanitation systems, clothing, washing machines, refrigeration, heating, cooling, computers, mobile phones, internet, transit, etc. This basket of goods and services has been developed through an extensive literature, e.g. Rao and Min, 2017, and Rao et al., 2019, and is summarized in Table 1, following Millward-Hopkins, 2022. Reader's note, same as the first part, I've included the link in the description if you want to look at the full article. About, halfway through, there's this table, Table 1, which is the DLS minimum requirements. Note that per capita values for food, living space, clothing, mobility are averaged across ages. Averages are reduced by the relatively lower requirements of infants and children. And they have 3 categories: DLS dimension, material requirements, and minimum activity levels. So feel free to take a look at that. It's a little bit of a longer table, but important. Back to the text. It is important to understand that DLS represents a minimum floor for decent living. It does not represent an aspirational standard and certainly does not represent a ceiling. However, it is also a level of welfare that is not presently achieved by the vast majority of people. A new paper by Hoffman et al. Finds that 96.5% of people in low and middle income countries are deprived on at least one DLS dimension. This study covers 66% of the population of low and middle income countries. If we assume the same level of deprivation holds across that whole country group, and if we ignore deprivation in high income countries, which has not yet been quantified using this method, we can conclude that at least 6.4 billion people, more than 80% of the world population, are deprived of DLS, or decent living standards. Ending DLS deprivation would therefore radically improve the lives of the majority of the world's population. Several studies have quantified the level of real resources necessary to achieve and sustain DLS for all. Millward-Hopkins, 2022, estimates that the annual energy requirements average 14.7 gigajoules per person if we assume global deployment of the most efficient technologies that are presently available, which is how the primary DLS scenario is defined, or 21.5 gigajoules per person per year using, quote, current technology, unquote, i.e. widely used best practice technology. These figures are based on a projected population of 8.5 billion in 2050, consistent with SSP1, whereby extending DLS to all would require 125 to 183 EJ, or exajoules per year. This amounts to 30 to 44% of current annual global energy use, which was 418 exajoules in 2019. Note that these are total annual requirements. To cover DLS gaps requires much less. Kijkstra et al. 2021 estimate that building out the infrastructure needed to cover DLS gaps by 2040 would require cumulative energy inputs of around 290 exajoules. This would mean approximately 19 exajoules per year from 2025 to 2040, which is less than 5% of current global energy use. Regarding materials, data from Velez Hinau and Pauliuk 2023 indicate that DLS can be provided with 3.27 tons per capita, summed across a variety of material categories with similar technology to that assumed by Millward-Hopkins. We derive this figure using the published reference scenario and assuming a shift toward renewable energy, vegetarian diets, efficient appliances, multifamily residential buildings, increased wood as a share of construction materials, and 54% of mobility presently provided by private cars shifted to public transit. Note that requirements can be reduced further to as little as 1.9 tons, with additional dietary changes. For comparison, we also assess a less ambitious scenario with a 4.74 ton requirement, using the published reference scenario and assuming only a shift toward renewable energy, efficient cooking appliances, and 27% of mobility presently provided by cars shifted to public transit. For a population of 8.5 billion, provisioning DLS would therefore require 28 to 40 gigatons of material per year, representing 29 to 42% of current global annual material use, which was 95 gigatons in 2019. These results are illustrated in Figure 2 and Figure 3 and compared to current global energy and material use, which represents energy and materials that are processed into final uses, real goods and services, buildings, and infrastructure, and therefore serves as a useful proxy for productive capacity. Reader's note again, Figures 2 and 3 are in the link in the description to the actual article. This demonstrates that global poverty can be eliminated and decent living standards can be extended to all with a modest share of existing global productive capacity and less energy and materials than the global economy presently uses, if production is organized around this objective. This leaves substantial surplus that can be used for various purposes, for additional public luxury, recreational facilities, technological innovation, scientific and creative advancement, and increasing the DLS threshold, for instance, with additional housing space, more computers, etc. To illustrate, the level of development represented by DLS can be multiplied by a factor of 3 and still extended to everybody in 2050 within existing global capacity. See Figures 2 and 3. Description for Figure 2 says global energy requirements in exajoules to ensure decent living standards, DLS, for 8.5 billion people in 2050, based on Millward-Hopkins 2022. DLS assumes global deployment of efficient technology. DLS-CT assumes current technology as described in the text. Figure 3's description is global material requirements, GT, to ensure decent living standards, DLS, for 8.5 billion people in 2050, based on Velez-Henao and Pauliuk 2023. DLS-LA is a lower ambition scenario as described in the text. Of course, it is reasonable to allow for some degree of inequality in the distribution of real resources. Millward-Hopkins estimates that a distribution consistent with public preferences, quote, fair inequality, unquote, requires allocating an additional 40% on top of DLS requirements. This would entail total global requirements of 175 exajoules of energy and 39 gigatons of materials, which is still well within existing productive capacity and still leaves a large surplus that can be used for additional consumption and other social investments. Note that future technological developments between now and 2050 and beyond could make it possible to provision higher living standards with less energy and materials, and this objective should be actively pursued. The data above indicate that ending poverty and ensuring good living standards for all does not require large increases in global aggregate production and throughput. It clearly does require substantial industrial development and increased total output in lower-income countries, while in higher-income countries it can be achieved while at the same time reducing less necessary output. But in all cases, North and South alike, the key is to focus on increasing certain types of production, including by redirecting productive capacities and reallocating energy and materials to different final uses, e.g. to produce housing and healthcare rather than casinos and fast fashion. It also requires deploying and disseminating efficient technologies internationally, including by suspending patents where necessary. Further research is underway to more precisely quantify the energy and material requirements of transitional pathways toward universal decent living, differentiated by world system region with attention to sufficient production corridors. Barnthaler and Gao, 2023. Asking how much global GDP is needed to end poverty is not a particularly helpful question. If human well-being is the objective, it is not GDP, aggregate output in market prices, that matters, but specific goods and services and whether people have access to them. It is not about generic production, but the content and purpose of production. To determine what the level of global GDP would be in a transition toward a universal decent living scenario would require sophisticated modeling. It depends on what sectors are increased and what sectors are reduced, how provisioning systems are changed, the kinds of technologies that are deployed, and the uses to which they are put. And it depends on how prices shift under these conditions and related processes, such as an increase in the bargaining power of labor and a reduction in unequal exchange between core and periphery. Indeed, precisely because GDP is a fungible indicator in which real material outputs are measured by something as ephemeral as market prices, it is not a useful tool for assessing how production needs to change in order to end poverty and achieve specific social goals. To answer this question, we need to pay attention to physical production and final use values, distinguishing between what is important for human well-being and what is not. 4. Conclusion. Narratives that assume deprivation can only be eliminated if all countries achieve the levels of GDP per capita that presently characterize high-income countries, are increasingly at odds with ecological reality and ignore the real constraints that developing countries face within the existing structure of the capitalist world economy. Fortunately, research on needs-based poverty and development advances important narratives that assume deprivation can only be eliminated if all countries achieve the levels of GDP per capita that presently characterize high-income countries are increasingly at odds with ecological reality and ignore the real constraints that developing countries face within the existing structure of the capitalist world economy. Fortunately, research on needs-based poverty and development advances important alternative solutions and resolves the false dilemma between human well-being and ecology. The question of how much production is necessary to end poverty cannot be answered by assessing PPP-based incomes or aggregate GDP. It is necessary to assess what is being produced and whether people have access to necessary goods and services. Development strategy should focus on ensuring the efficient production of and universal access to the specific goods that people require to achieve decent lives and good social outcomes, including nutritious food, safe housing, healthcare, education, sanitation, transit, information technology, and household durables. This can be done while also reducing less necessary forms of production, particularly in high-income countries, in order to bring resource use back to sustainable levels. For a discussion of how state transformation can be financed, see Olk et al., 2023. Ending global poverty and ensuring good lives for all while meeting ecological objectives at the same time requires a new framework for conceptualizing convergence. Excess energy and material use must decline in the core to achieve ecological objectives, while in the periphery, productive capacities must be reclaimed, reorganized, and in most cases, increased to meet human needs and achieve human development objectives, with throughput converging globally to levels that are sufficient for universal well-being and compatible with ecological stability. For the core, this requires sufficiency-oriented strategies, reducing less necessary forms of production and consumption, extending product lifespans, reducing the purchasing power of the rich, transitioning from private cars to public transit, etc., while improving and securing access to necessary goods and services, alongside efficiency improvements and feasible technological change. These strategies can enable high-income countries to decarbonize fast enough to stay within their fair shares of Paris-compliant carbon budgets. This is challenging within a capitalist market economy, however, because capital generally requires increasing aggregate output, GDP, to stabilize accumulation. And because in capitalist economies, any reduction of aggregate output triggers social crises characterized by mass layoffs and unemployment. Furthermore, under capitalism, decisions about production are made by wealthy investors, with the primary goal of maximizing private profits rather than meeting social and ecological goals. Necessary goods and services that are not profitable are often underproduced, e.g. Christopher's 2022. Post-capitalist approaches are therefore needed, including public finance for urgently necessary forms of production, e.g. public transit, renewable energy, insulation, efficient appliances, establishing universal public services to ensure access to necessary goods, planning to reduce less necessary output in a just and equitable way, and guaranteeing universal access to employment and livelihoods through a public job guarantee and income floor. For the Global South, a different set of challenges must be overcome. During the past 40 years, developing economies have been structured by policies imposed by international financial institutions and foreign capital to focus production on exports to the core in subordinate positions within global commodity chains at artificially depressed prices and with unfavorable terms of trade, while remaining dependent on imports of necessary technologies and capital goods. Smith, 2016. As a result of this arrangement, labor, land, and resources in the Global South are devoted to producing, say, fast fashion and consumer technologies for northern firms, overwhelmingly consumed in the Global North, instead of producing nutritious food, housing, sanitation systems, and hospitals for national needs. To reclaim productive capacities for national development, governments need to use progressive industrial and fiscal policy, public works programs, and public investment in innovation to plan production of necessary goods, services, and technologies. Hickel and Sullivan, 2023. At present, these steps are largely precluded by the conditions imposed by structural adjustment programs and international creditors. Escaping these constraints requires reducing dependence on imports from the core, and therefore on foreign capital, including through South-South trade and swap lines and canceling external debts where necessary. Southern governments can and should take unilateral or collective steps toward sovereign industrial development and should be supported toward this end. Poverty is not an intractable problem that requires complex solutions, long time frames, and large increases in production and throughput that conflict with ecological objectives. The solution is straightforward. We need to actively plan to shift productive capacities away from capital accumulation and elite consumption in order to focus instead on the goods and services that are necessary to meet human needs and enable decent living for all, while ensuring universal access through public provisioning systems. We have framed this work around the concept of human needs, following the recent literature. However, it is important to underscore that this approach is ultimately about far more than just satisfying material requirements for human well-being. Achieving decent living for all is critical to enabling broader human capabilities, individual and collective self-realization, full participation in society and politics, and ultimately, freedom. And that will wrap up the article. Thank you for reading along with me. This has been How Much Growth is Required to Achieve Good Lives for All? Insights from Needs-Based Analysis, written by Jason Hickel and Dylan Sullivan, read by Naomi Kirst-Schultz,